Well, hey, everybody. I'm Petu Washte, Machiapi David Heska Wanbli Weiden, and it's my pleasure to be here today. I want to give a land acknowledgement. This is as I did this morning, for those of you that participated, it's such a weird thing in that we are all spread out all over, I believe, but I will acknowledge the indigenous land upon which we are standing, wherever you are, I suppose even in Norway. Um, so I will just simply make that a general acknowledgement. But I do also want to give a big thank you to VCFA, both the administrators and the students. Thank you for making this happen. This is a strange time for all of us. And I'm just so delighted. As was noted in my introduction, I'm a former VCFA student. In the low residency program in writing, I spent 3 semesters, really 3 wonderful formative semesters. So I have a deep love for the school, and I'm so glad that I was able to participate, although I'm of course deeply disappointed that I'm not back in Montpelier and visiting the 3 Penny Tap Room, if that's still there. I suppose it's closed now, and the pizza place and the wonderful bookstores. It's just a charming town, and I'm hoping to visit it. So thank you. So let me go ahead. I'm going to read 2 very short things here. Today, I gave a short lecture on Native American creative nonfiction. So I'm going to read a snippet from an unpublished piece that I have called Major Crimes. I received a fellowship from the PEN America organization to write this. And the piece is a true piece. Everything here is real in my life. I was writing, the piece largely deals with the murder of my auntie and my cousin, another cousin. So I have 2 first cousins, and one of them murdered his mother and then murdered his little brother and then stole a car and this was on the Rosebud Reservation where my people are from, and then started driving south to come and kill me and my mother. I was only 2 years old at the time. He was, however, caught and spent quite a few years in prison. So I write about the mass incarceration of American Indians and other topics in this creative nonfiction piece. But while I was writing the piece, something else happened in my life. And so I added another section to the paper, which I think I will probably expand to its own piece. So just to get you caught up, because I don't have time to read the whole piece, the people that were murdered were my auntie Charlotte and my cousin Gregory. So here is the ending of Major Crimes. And then time permitting, I'll possibly read a little bit of fiction. We'll see how long this takes. But again, thank you so much for taking time to listen to me and my words. This is Major Crimes. But the shadows would come again for my family. Just like little Gregory decades earlier, in May of 2019, my 11-year-old son Sasha huddled in a pitch black room, listening to gunshots, waiting to find out if he would live or die when the door opened. Just answer it, Professor. My cell phone is vibrating incessantly in my briefcase, ringing over and over, interrupting the lecture I'm giving in my law and society class. We're discussing the horrific case of Dred Scott versus Sanford, wherein the Supreme Court ruled that slaves were not American citizens, but were rather a subordinate and inferior class of beings who had been subjugated by the dominant race. Apologizing, I turn away and pick up the phone. I see from the display that it's my ex-wife, Marina, with whom I share custody of our 2 children. I tap the screen and accept the call. There's a shooting at Sasha's school. I can't reach him. He's not answering his phone. My son is in the 6th grade at STEM School Highlands Ranch, a combined elementary, middle, and high school for technologically gifted youth. My students confirm the news as word of the incident begins to spread across social media and websites. I quickly cancel class and start for the door. Before I can leave, one student gives me a hug, his face filled with concern and dread. Some of the others have tears in their eyes. Once I'm outside, I call my son on his cell phone. No answer. I run for the parking lot and get into my car. It's an hour-long drive back to Sasha's school, and I call my ex-wife, who's on the verge of panicking. She tells me that other parents have been able to reach their children, but she can't get our son to pick up. Then she tells me that the media is reporting multiple fatalities. It's early rush hour, and I drive as fast as I can while switching between AM radio stations, hoping to get some information. My phone begins exploding with text messages and calls, but I keep my eyes on the road. I start to pray, sending my thoughts out to the Creator, hoping that the darkness unleashed by my cousin so many decades ago has not returned. I recite my prayer silently, over and over, a mantra against the bleak reports on the radio. Please spare my son. Please spare my son. Spare him. There's an army of SWAT team members at the school, now blockaded, and all parents are directed to the gym at a nearby recreation center to wait for news. Hundreds of parents are inside, some weeping, some in shock, and some strangely jovial. These are the ones who were lucky enough to reach their children on their mobile phones and confirm their safety. For these parents, it's a chance to take time off from work and catch up with friends. My ex-wife and I are not so fortunate. We walk around the large space asking people what they've heard. Some say there was one shooter, others say two. One man tells us that the shooting happened in the high school section of the school. Then we hear that it occurred in the middle school where Sasha is enrolled. Someone tells us that there were several dozen shot. Another person says 10. The basketball court is unbearably hot and humid, and volunteers come around with bottles of water. I'm grateful for this small kindness, a temporary moment of relief. There's a small dog near me, and I pet him, stroking his head and behind his ears. The dog's eyes close in canine bliss, and I stare at the ceiling, trying to silence the thoughts in my head. 3 hours later, Sasha is returned to us. Marina and I both weeping as we embrace him. He tells us of the panicked student running into his classroom, he and his classmates then huddling in a dark closet, listening to gunfire, the tennis racket his teacher grasped for protection, and the fear he felt when the closet door opened, not knowing if the killer was coming in. I hold him, rejoicing in his presence. My son is alive. 1 week after the shooting, Sasha and I arrive at the megachurch a few miles from the school. We're at the memorial service for Kendrick Castillo, the young man who charged the shooter first, taking several shots in the chest and dying on the spot. His actions allowed a second group of boys to tackle the gunman and disarm him. While the first set of students held the shooter down, another group attempted to help Kendrick using t-shirts and towels to try and stop the bleeding in his chest. Kendrick, the only child of his parents, was just 3 days away from his high school graduation. An unlikely hero, he was no athlete, but rather a stocky young man, Latino and indigenous, planning to study engineering at a local college. His bravery overwhelms me, and I feel it's important to attend the service, both for myself and my son. In the week after the shooting, I've been experiencing mild panic attacks and anxiety, which I've tried to shrug off. The sheriff's department granted Kendrick full honors, and there are several dozen police officers standing at attention in the lobby of the church, as well as numerous Knights of Columbus in full dress. Hundreds of Jeeps, Kendrick's favorite vehicle, are parked outside, the message, "Thank you, Kendrick," painted on the windows. There's a table in the lobby displaying some of the items from his youth, a Dr. Seuss book, his favorite cap, a pair of scuffed cowboy boots. I struggle to maintain my composure as I look at these things. Sasha and I take our seats in the section for STEM school students. There are 2 giant video screens inside the church, and we watch the formal procession of police cars and limousines accompany the hearse, which pulls up right in front. The police officers salute the casket as it's brought inside. There are 3,000 people present, and all stand absolutely silent as the casket is slowly wheeled to the front of the stage. The service begins, and we listen to a pastor and singers, and several of Kendrick's classmates share stories. anecdotes of going to restaurants and competing on the robotics team. Then his engineering teacher, Mr. Schallenberger, takes the stage. He tells of Kendrick's natural ability in robotics and technology and announces that Kendrick has been awarded the top engineering student award, blue and white honor cords meant to be worn on a graduation cap. Rather than hand them to Kendrick's parents, he steps down off the stage and drapes them across the casket. He breaks down in tears, and we are all crying now, the students and parents wailing. I'm crying too, crying for this young man who may have saved my own son's life, crying for his parents who will never see him grow into adulthood, crying for all of the parents who lived through that terrible day. The sobbing of the audience becomes louder, no longer weeping, but instead a terrible keening as we tap into all of the sadness the world has ever known. I'm crying for Kendrick and for every parent who's lost a child, their unspeakable sorrow and grief, and for Charlotte and little Gregory, their lives also taken too soon. The teacher slowly walks off the stage. Sasha, my son, takes my hand and says, "I love you, Dad." And in that moment, I feel the weight of my ancestors, and I hope there is some justice, some absolution for Kendrick, Charlotte, Gregory, and even Clarence. I stare at my son as the music from the church musicians rises and falls, rises and falls. Thank you. Oh, thank you. I see you. All right. I will read now an equally depressing piece, and I'm sorry about that. So I will read, thank you so much for the virtual clapping. Sasha, my son, just is fine, just so you know. So the shooting at STEM School Highlands Ranch, the trial is still going on of the two shooters. Sasha is fine. He has experienced some emotional distress here and there, but he's a resilient little guy and he is doing just fine. So just to share that with you. Let me now read a section from my forthcoming novel, Winter Counts. This is a very short section. Just to set this piece up, the protagonist hero of my novel is Virgil Wounded Horse, who is a hired vigilante that people go to on the Rosebud Indian Reservation when they can't get justice. Virgil is a recovering alcoholic, and in this section, he's gone to Denver to go after some drug dealers that have brought heroin to the Rosebud Indian Reservation. But he finds himself in a bar for the first time in a while, and he is tempted to take a drink. So here is a very short chapter from Winter Counts. An elder I knew had called me, begging me to go check on her grandchild, Mikey, who lived with her son and his girlfriend out by Parmalee. We'd been in one of our terrible snowstorms, temperatures 20 below zero, and she hadn't heard from the child's mother, who wasn't from South Dakota. Nearly all families in the surrounding towns heated their homes with propane, and sometimes people froze to death if they missed out on a propane delivery. She told me that her son was out looking for work in Sioux Falls, but that the girlfriend was staying in their trailer looking after their little boy, who was only 2. I'd seen the girlfriend at the grocery store. She was young, maybe 22 or 23, with red hair and a nose ring. The little boy was cute. I remembered his Superman t-shirt and his big smile. I'd fired up my car and slowly driven north, dodging the wind drifts and trying to stay on the road. It took a while to find the trailer in the snow, and there were no street signs or house numbers to go by. The elder had told me that I'd recognize the place by a large painting of Mickey Mouse on the front wall of the trailer. After a while, I spotted it. Whoever had done the painting was no Rembrandt, and it looked more like Bart Simpson than Mickey Mouse, but at least I'd found it. There was a Ford Taurus parked in front, just outside of the fence. I'd put on my cap, gloves, hoodie, and overcoat to brave the bitter chill. Even though I was only 100 miles away from my home, it was colder here, and I felt the moisture inside my nose freezing as soon as I got out of my car. I knocked on the door to the trailer, but there was no answer. I waited for a second and banged on the door even louder. It was dangerously cold, and I couldn't wait outside for more than a minute or two. I gave it one more bang and then tried the door. To my surprise, it was unlocked, and I went inside. It was cold in there, but not freezing. That was a relief. I took a look around the small living room. Empty beer cans, Bud Lights, maybe 24 strewn around. An empty Smirnoff vodka bottle, one of the big ones, and the stench of stale beer, powerful even in the cold air. No one was around, and I wondered if the girl and her son had gone to stay with neighbors to wait out the storm. Hello, anyone here? No answer. I walked over to the bathroom, which was by the small cooking area. No one in there. The door to the bedroom was closed. It wasn't a real door. It was one of those sliding vinyl accordion units that don't give you any true privacy. I slid it back, the vinyl protesting in the chill. There was a small mountain of clothes on the floor and a Murphy bed by the wall with 4 or 5 blankets on top. I was wondering if I should go drive out to the neighbors when I saw the blankets move a little. I tried to remember the woman's name. Was it Rose? Hey, someone there, I said, stripping the blankets back. The mother was there under the covers, passed out cold. Her red hair had been dyed green at the tips, and her nose ring was turned up, giving her a comical look. I could smell the alcohol reeking from her, along with some other vile smell. Her skin was even paler than I remembered. You okay? No response, so I felt her forehead, which was chilly to the touch. She was breathing, but slowly. If she drank all the booze in the other room, she must be plastered beyond belief, maybe even suffering from alcohol poisoning. I wondered how I'd get her to the hospital in this storm. I looked around the room for some winter clothes to put on her. But where was Mikey? I pulled the entire mess of blankets off the bed, assuming that the child was curled up in there asleep. No dice. I looked on the floor next to the bed, under the pile of clothes, and in the small closet. No child. I yelled out, Mikey! No response. I went back to the living room, then the bathroom. I opened up cabinets, looked in trash piles and behind furniture. I remembered from Nathan's early years that 2-year-olds could get into spaces that you wouldn't expect, so I tore that trailer up. No luck. Then I went back to the bedroom and I shook the mother, hard. I grabbed her shoulders and shouted at her, Rose, where's Mikey? Did you take him somewhere? Where is he? She opened her eyes for a moment. They were going in different directions, so I knew it was pointless to try and wake her up. And then I had a scary thought. Could the boy have wandered outside? I remembered that the front door had been unlocked. There was no back door, so I ran outside the front and looked around the yard. It was still snowing, but I was able to see. There were no footprints, but that didn't mean anything, given the snowfall we'd had. Mikey, I shouted as I ran around the back and scanned for any snowdrifts. Mikey! It was freezing cold outside, but I didn't notice the temperature. Could he be under the trailer in the crawl space below? I crawled down to the base of the trailer and started digging out snow. It was dark under there, but I didn't see anything. I stood up and looked outside the cheap fence they put up right by their car. Their car, the Ford Taurus. I hadn't looked in there, but that was pointless, right? There was no way the kid could be in there, not in this weather. I walked over to the vehicle. It was an older model, one of the boxy ones. The windows were iced up and I couldn't see inside. The driver's side door wouldn't open, it was frozen shut. So I tried the passenger door. With some effort, I was able to pry it open. I looked inside. There was a child safety seat in the back, Graco model, dark gray with black straps. My sister Sybil had bought one of those car seats for Nathan after obsessively researching the safety records of the different brands. She'd worked so hard to keep baby Nathan safe. I remembered the baby proofing all over the house, the outlet plugs, the padding on sharp corners, all of this work to protect children from their slips and falls when it was the grown-ups who needed to be muzzled and padded from their own misdeeds and transgressions. Little Mikey was strapped inside the seat, not moving. His eyes were open, staring straight ahead into nothingness. not moving, not blinking, frozen solid. It was quiet, so quiet in that car. The falling snowflakes looked like tiny blades in the dying light, and I saw a rabbit skitter across the snow, hurrying for some shelter. Just for a second, I wondered if I could go back in time somehow, just rewind the last several days, suspend the laws of physics. Maybe there was something on the internet, or perhaps some famous scientist could visit the res, showing how it was possible to go back and change events, like a movie running in reverse. Anything so I wouldn't have to look at this beautiful little boy again in this car, in this storm. The last I'd heard, the mother of the child had been charged with felony child abuse and negligent homicide for getting drunk and leaving the child in the car overnight. After I gave the statement to the police, I didn't follow the case. I wanted to forget, but no matter how hard I tried, I hadn't been able to shake the image of that little boy. Sometimes I'd remember his face when I saw little kids playing in the park. Sometimes I'd see him when I was driving out in the country. Now here he was again, his sweet face. I pushed back the full beer and the shot of whiskey I'd ordered, untouched, and I walked out of the hangar bar. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We will hear from Kenzie next. And there's all kinds of virtual clapping happening in the chat space. When that calms down, I am gonna post that call-in number again, because I've noticed a lot of people coming in and out, so I wonder if there's some connection issues happening. Take it away.
Thank you, David. That was incredible. Wow. Okay. Seguli swagwek, Kenzie ni yugat, kwe weni, waknyata ni wagidaloda. So hello to all of you, or as we would say in my home state, hey y'all. My name's Kenzie. I am Oneida, or we say Onayodeaga, which means the people of the standing stone. It's part of the Haudenosaunee, or probably better known as Iroquois Confederacy. And I am Turtle Clan. So from here in Norway, I am wishing you all the very best, and thank you all, Yawanko, for letting me share my work with you today. I'm still learning my Oneida language, but whenever I read, I like to kind of put the words into the air, because it's a bit of a joyful experience to be doing that. And with that said, I am going to start with a couple of poems that haven't quite, or they've made it into a manuscript, but it's much more of a page poetry-based manuscript. And then I will share some more work from my recent project, for which I actually do have just a few slides. They're not like complicated, but they are visual pieces, so maybe that'll help out. So bear with me while I get that, when I get that started. Yeah, so this is a poem that came out in Boston Review, and they did a really beautiful reading of it. But so it was like a professional reader reading it, like who does audiobooks and things. And I learned a lot about the poem from them reading it, but I don't necessarily get to read it that often. So I'm going to start with this poem called Token. So far, I've lost sleep, but not children. So far, I've lost tongues, but not air. Bought my voice in the institutions. So far off res, I must be an apple. I've left this country a turtle, have come back red and barbed, raised volume in all the wrong rooms, made a bad reputation with all my sinew. I stare at those coffee mugs in the China hutch, their southern patterns, Ute, black and white lines, painted and fired, and not Oneida, but here, and I, here, and not also inside cupboards. Beads all over the closet. practice my yoyanlari, only true if I too can manifest. I leave the house an apple. I come home a harpy. The zoom no longer cropped on my camera's lens, but reframed, pulled back as bad acid, the world's horizon sucked into vanishing. And we see you, all high rises and the occasional generous park, sweet talk the ocean into terraform. Of course, the island's purchase would not contain destiny. You build upon it glass and curved steel, nightlife, financial district, cab stations for the hurried. Sky Woman is not here. The muskrats also buried. Even the waves quicken and someday boil. So this next one is kind of in a set of, I've been working with love poems lately. I find them to be sort of an interesting form, and I've always sort of struggled with them because you can go either the really trite direction or you just have no idea what to say about it. But I've sort of been hitting my groove with them lately, and I think this might turn out to be a chapbook or a longer book of these kinds of love songs. So this is honoring both my heritages here. This is Love Song to the Man Announcing Powwows and Rodeos. How your voice over salted flanks licks tender. And when you say young ones, our future, hitches left like making room. And when you name the horses, booms low, storms a kick-up moan, chases them down, a spotted silverfish in a round pen coral, then shoot back out the entrance, spotlit and away in a shuddering. Name me a jingle dress in neon and gold leaf, bespeak moccasins for my turning feet, with my mother's best beading. Paint her having sown those seeds onto leather backing all of my life. Welcome the crowd to my birth and the language to my ears early, my name early, wampum and the good spirits everywhere and early. Don't send me home without a round of applause, if not a title, if not a good ride and a fast time. So now I'm gonna have to try to switch to this. So I'm gonna have to switch to this presentation, I think. Yes, I think I can figure this out. So maybe I have to do it with my entire screen, so bear with me. And so this is Indian Country, and this was originally published in Slice magazine, just as a typical kind of page poem. But when I started working on this new manuscript, it became obvious that there was absolutely no reason why I wouldn't go ahead and like make a version that followed the snake game. So this is based on that old video game that you might have had on your Nokia phone a million years ago, or sometimes they have newer ones now, but it's the snake game. So this is the snake game, but it's called Indian Country. I compare it to that snake game where you can't touch the walls or any of those blocks that spontaneously manifest to remap the field, to show by design, you've entered another level and things will be fraught. There is always an apple. It is your sole objective to devour. You are the snake. You can turn on a dime, a unit. You can turn again upon yourself. No square foot of you small enough to avoid your own jaws. The apple, they shine up with a lick of hashtag FFF. It appears endlessly in another quadrant as soon as it touches your endlessly parted snake lips. It is pixel mirage, bitter home, and enemy. You catch the first few with ease. In fact, it is more a matter of waiting. Fruit in far corner, you inch slyly, achingly, expand at beginner's speed. Each apple fortifies, adds another ending, a liability, and 300 points. In place of final showdown, the big boss fight, in place of a glowing 5-unit heart, only an algorithm, more cinder blocks, a smaller stage, the dwindling of space, the burgeoning of self. The apples, wearisome, the reflexive click of arrows numbed. It's not a question of winning, I explain to no one. It's however long you last. Okay, so this would be westward. So this is back on the lookout tower. As though God's country, vast territories lay waiting, virginal and uninhabited by rude world's greed, a kingdom for settlers to shape or refine, to disallow the undesired. I was never the best shot on the Oregon Trail, but took my fill in the game. The buffalo wandered lonely and slow, endlessly begat at screen's edge. Where survival depends on days of rest, one good trade can salvage the illness of children and self. From independence to blue mountains, in the end, all that's left are the rapids. Pilgrims of freedom, intrepid pioneers, if I am guarded, I am also the guard. Duda yuyan lari. Things are getting better because wagedunhade, I'm happy. Waskewa, let's go on. How do you know you're in the west beyond the tilted brim? The sun setting, and if you hit the ocean, you've gone as far as you can. The unexplored dwindling. My father made me a map each year of our summer journey, from West Texas to West Coast, the Arches, Salt Lake, crossing the Snake, where no friendly Indians point the way. Just me, finding the car in every crowded lot, or pulled by water scent in deep wood, guided by kindling and kindred stars. So I don't want to take up too much time, so I'm going to leave on this last poem, which is yet another love poem. And so I dedicate this to my partner here in Norway, Andreas, which is one of the reasons I'm in Norway. So this is, when I say I love you, this is what I mean. Perhaps these words too will vanish. The electricity will fail, memory cards corrupt, the generators run down, and eventually the pages decompose or burn. I am no Greek, kept alive in libraries or the minds of curious men. These equations I write, not vital to our survival or progress. My telomeres will weaken. I'm not immune to age. And if I want it remembered, the way you asked my skin to sing for you, or how your scalp locks the scent of Oregon, the lookout tower, the flames just past the horizon, I can't hold it or make it stay, no matter how clever my pen, my fingers at keys. Your arms will fade from knowing the particular blue hunger of you debauched in the confine of colored ink. Somewhere there's a museum of best mixes, azure, lapis, mummy, and ochre, lined on shelves in glass vestibules, preserved for future study. There are interns responsible for dusting each collection, for keeping the markers in good repair. So if I am the servant, whittling time, only to have it return out of knowing, if my body stains the air and settles on cruets or seeps into rags to become the perfect brown dunes and their shadows, my innards, the crimson cloak on a worshiper, if I am the pigment and the vessel, why not blue? Why not the light through the fogged air of that mountain? Why not memory engraved in something stronger, a stone arrow to arms that were and are good? So Yowanko, thank you for your attention.
That was so, so beautiful. Thank you, Kenzie. Thank you so much. Our next reader will be Erika.
Hi, folks. So I was worried that I would accidentally actually hang up instead of unmute my mic. So hold on a second here, let me fix this so it makes more sense to me. No, it doesn't make any more sense. Let me try this. Yeah, either way. Thank you so much for having me here. I really have such an honor to read with David and Kenzie. You know, I've worked really hard throughout my career to sort of, you know, build up Native writers and make sure that we have opportunities to hang out together and read together and pump each other up. And so for someone else to create that for us is such a lovely thing. And I also run a reading series at my university, and it's a lot of work. I mean, even when you're only doing a chunk of it, it's a tremendous amount of work. So thank you, Lizzie and Rita, and everyone else who worked so hard, and especially in the middle of a pandemic to make this happen, because it's just no joke. Like I said, I do this, so I know. I'm going to try this one more time to see if it makes more sense. Sidebar. I don't even know what I'm doing, clearly. I'm going to read from, there we go, from Buckskin Cocaine. It is a collection of short stories, or kind of like a novel. What is the word for it, where it's a novel, like a novel in stories. Mainly it's like increasingly a number of short stories, kind of beginning in a more experimental aesthetic and ending in a more traditional novella with a traditional aesthetic. But for the most part, it's basically about the film world. I was a guest writer at the Institute of American Indian Arts a number of years ago, and the writing world can be really brutal, but my introduction to the film world struck me as so brutal. Like the desire for fame is so desperate. And when you're talking about Native Americans who, you know, there are beautiful parts about our worlds, but there are also brutal parts. And looking at how there's no way around it, how misogynistic that world was, and how desperate and hungry and sad from the writers to the directors. There was no way around it. It was like this incredibly weird reflection of the writing world, and just an interesting world in and of itself. And I felt like it didn't get talked a lot about. And when people talk about Native American film, they always think like, you know, these sort of buckskin images and, you know, all these, you know, John Wayne Westerns, and maybe at the best case scenario, smoke signals. And so I wanted to write a little bit from the point of view of these different personalities sort of struggling in this world. And I wanted to be really unafraid to show how brutal that world was and how human these people were. And I think that's something that's kind of important to me, no matter what. So the first piece I'm going to read from Buckskin Cocaine is Candy Francois. And this is kind of a funny piece, dark. Certainly the whole book is fairly dark. And Candy has a particular way of speaking, so sort of bear with me. There are so many gorgeous photos of me, and I'm beautiful in every one of them. Thin, perfect, frozen in time. And the drugs were lovely. They were like ice skating with your best friend when you were 8, like falling in love, like living on cake. I was in New York for 6 years in a loft in the West Village when I first met George. George, that womanizing, shitty filmmaker. I had a wonderful life. I lived with a ton of other artists, but I was the only Native American. That made me unique. When I wasn't modeling, I was doing professional work for clubs. That part was my favorite because they would have us dress up so crazy. But then sometimes I'd get a buckskin gig for a Native magazine, my face all stoic and my body covered in beads and leather on the cover, and that would be wonderful. I would send a copy to mom, who would send a copy to grandma, and they would write me and tell me how beautiful I was, but when was I going to settle down? I thought the answer to that was never, because getting older wasn't real. It wasn't something I ever thought about. It didn't even exist. I was in my early 20s. I was a model. I lived in New York. I was dating a senator for a while there when I was 22. A fucking senator. He was married. I had to keep it quiet. But the things he bought me, and we did so much blow. My friends loved him because he would come to our apartment smelling of money and beauty and roll out the expensive drugs and take us all to dinner. And let me tell you how much he loved for me to put on the black leather gear I'd gotten from some of those club gigs and whip his white ass. I loved it too. I loved everything about that time. My life was so glamorous and trashy and lovely, and I was drunk and high, and I felt like a rock star, like I was living inside a neon light, like I was a god. I was in my early 20s. I was a model. I lived in New York. The first time I met George, I just come from a shoot in Paris. I remember walking around that golden city filled with such an intense feeling of euphoria. It was sexual. Thin, dressed in a Christian Dior suit, my dyed black hair down to my ass, the men in that city practically falling all over themselves for La Belle Amérindienne, and me struggling past and laughing on my way to meet some actor and director friends at a hip new restaurant. I'd been given a bit part in a little film, and it was premiering at Red Stick in Santa Fe, and I was ecstatic. I was sure that I would make it into film. Much as I love dressing up for my buckskin gigs or for powwow or ceremony for that matter, I was happy to play anything. I could pass for a lot of ethnicities. I'd even dyed my hair blonde once. And this was my first part in a movie, and it had been a long time in coming. I'd been auditioning for years. I told myself that struggle was a part of it, that it was all about courage, about not giving up. When I'd audition, they'd get this really excited look when I'd come in. But when I'd read, that look would fade, and I would leave feeling more and more defeated and depressed every time. I didn't understand. I'd taken a ton of classes at the New School. I figured that modeling was a lot like acting. You had to act when you modeled, you had to have presence. And I did. Everyone said I looked like I was about to go through the camera and eat whoever was on the other side. But modeling had been easy to break into. I told myself that the acting world was more complicated, more competitive, that it was only a matter of time. I was in my early 20s. I was a model. I lived in New York. I was at a party after the premiere in Santa Fe when one of my friends elbowed me and pointed me in the direction of a fat little Navajo guy. As you can tell, she's not the nicest lady. "That's George Bill," she said. And I said, "He's a director." I eyed him and he took it as some kind of cue to come up and start talking to me. I was irritated because I hate it when gross men think that they have the right to hit on me. He asked my name. I asked his. And he shook my hand with one of his wet little paws. He was quick to tell me that his film had premiered at Sundance. His friend Robert was right behind him. And after a while, it was clear that those two went around like a married couple. Later, I found out that Robert's film had premiered at Sundance too, and that it did a lot better than George's. Robert stared at me all bug-eyed and silent and drank the PBRs that he brought, and George kept going on and on about how important he was until I became bored. But I knew that I had to play nice, so I acted flirtatious, like what he was saying was entertaining. But I wanted to strangle his fat little neck when he said something about my friend Sheena being nothing but a pretty little cunt. I'm sure it was because she didn't want to fuck him. He told me that I played a really good vampire, and his little wife Robert snorted drink out of his nose and took off towards the bathroom. "Don't mind him," George said, and I nodded, though I disliked him even more. I did, however, let him have my phone number right before he left with Robert, as I knew he was a potentially important connection. Robert had been whining, "Can't we go?" in between gulps of PBR like a 6-year-old nearly all night. George texted me for hours. I kept texting LOL back. He seemed to like that. Then I went home with this beautiful Cree actor from Canada who's in another film that was premiering at Red Stick. I wondered the next day if I should have been nicer, but after a couple of weeks, it was like, fuck that guy. Because after the first film, I got another bit part and then later another, both with low budget native productions. For a while, I started to believe that things were really happening, but I was never given any lines or very few, and it kept landing me right back at Red Stick. And George was always there, always trying to fuck me. And I would nod and flirt and text him back and go home with someone beautiful. That's the most humiliating part about it, that for years I brushed him away like he was an insect, like he was something I'd stepped on with one of my Louboutin heels. Also, I'm Ojibwe and Cree. I practically dwarfed that fucker. And he must have thought that I was a moron. I found out pretty quickly that he only did Navajo films, cast Navajo actors, but he liked to find women like me, mixed women, tall women, and indicate that he might cast them and then fuck them and move on to the next. Please. I've been using people for years in New York. I knew what it looked like from both sides. If I was going to fuck someone, it was because I was either going to get something from them or because I really actually wanted to fuck them. I was in my early 20s. I was a model. I lived in New York. One night in New York, after I'd been feeling unusually tired, and I just had another audition that I'd obviously blown, I wanted to party. And just my luck, Sheena's boyfriend, who was an executive for Starbucks, was in town, and we were all invited to his loft in Manhattan. It was decorated like the inside of a cloud, white and silver. The carpet was thick and soft and bone white, and the chandeliers were these strange, lovely things that looked more like sculptures than light fixtures. I was wearing something blue and silky, and it was dripping off of me. I sat down on the couch, and someone handed me a glass of Pinot, and I leaned back, my tan arms looking like some sort of precious metal against the white Italian leather of the couch. People were laughing, and I recognized an actor who I'd just seen in Woody Allen's latest. I took a snort of Coke and sipped at the wine, and it felt magical. The music coming from the stereo like a dream. I felt invincible, like I was inside one of the chandeliers, like I was pure light, like I was pure. I began to float. I don't remember falling towards a glass table in front of me, my wine glass smashing against it, my nose gushing blood. I don't remember Sheena calling 911 or the ride in the ambulance to the hospital where I died twice. I remember waking up in the hospital, talking to the doctor about all of the drugs, the booze, the late nights. I remember Mom flying in from Minneapolis and crying over my bed, my thin, warm white sheets making me feel like a ghost. I couldn't understand it. I was in my early 20s. I was a model. I lived in New York. 6 months later, after Mom had taken me home, after months in a room I hadn't seen for years, after a suicide attempt, after counseling, after several hysterical breakdowns on the part of my mom, I was back at Red Stick at a party at one of Sheena's friends' houses. He was a buckskin actor. He had been bragging all night about the latest Western he'd been in, his long black braids glistening in the light, a joint squeezed in between the fingers of his left hand. My friend Sheena was flirting with crazy Gary Hollywood because she was on shrooms. I was about half a bottle of white wine in, and there was George on the other side of the room, a glass of Patron in his little hand. He didn't recognize me at first, and then when he did, he smiled. I smiled back. My room in New York had been taken over by another model. She was Jamaican. She was 18. I had just turned 25. But some friends of mine had hired me to do PR for a documentary, and at least I was out of my mother's house. George came over and told me I looked hot, and I snorted and asked him to refill my wine glass. He did. I drank. I thought about all the stuff Mom had been filling my head with for the last 6 months in between feeding and feeding me about how I wasn't getting any younger and did I want a baby and that my modeling days were behind me. And if I got married, how I needed to find an enrolled native because I was just under half. And if I had a kid, that kid wouldn't be enrolled unless I did. And that whoever it was better not be a bum like the people I'd lived with in New York. Where's Robert? I asked. And it was George's turn to snort. I didn't ask. I drank more wine. And he asked me about my life and told me about his latest film, how it was about Indian boarding schools. And I told him that my grandma had been to one and about what had happened to her there. And then we ended up in a back bedroom, and afterwards I cried. And though he pet my arm awkwardly, I could feel how desperately he wished he wasn't there. After about an hour in the dark, my eyes wide open, George got up and quietly put his clothes on. For a moment, I thought he might be pausing to see if my eyes were open or shut, but he was only struggling to put on one of his shoes. After I heard the front door close, I got up and wrapped a long blue sheet around my body and walked through the now deserted living room and opened the front door. I stood at the door for a while, watching his car disappear down the road, into the desert, into the dark. It smelled like rain, and I felt sick and twisted inside, like a dark, dark, dying, gangrenous thing. I closed the door and walked over to the kitchen and pulled a bottle of tequila out of the mess of bottles. There was blood on the counter where a dancer who George was going to throw me over for at another party in 2 weeks had taken the cork out of a wine bottle without a corkscrew, and it ended up breaking the bottle and cutting her hand deeply. She had laughed, and the men had rushed over to help. I went back over to the couch and sat down with the tequila and drank hard. I lit up a cigarette and tried to push away the deep, wide darkness that was beginning to fill me. I stared at the empty white walls. There was nothing. My God, 6 months ago, I was in my early 20s. I was a model. I lived in New York. So that is Candy. Happy ending though. She got a man and a baby. so she's had a happy ending. The next piece I want to read is even shorter, and I'm going to end with it. It's called Gary Hollywood. This is the one where I think you can probably feel, that kind of poetic technique that I borrow from sometimes in this piece. So, but yeah, Candy is ultimately probably my favorite out of this collection, I have to admit. Gary Hollywood. The red grasses, that's what I remember. Threading my little brown hands through them on the hills in Oklahoma, my mother calling in Cherokee from the warm little cabin in the distance, the smell of smoking meats. It was so beautiful, but the memory is even more beautiful. Even then, I knew I was born for blood. When I drink for the pain. I drink because I can. Because there is so much blood filling my heart, it's spilling over. I trip on the slick of it. Years ago, years before all of the lights filling my eyes, over and over, the images of me up there for everyone to see, I went to war. We all went to war then. We went because we thought we had to. Warrior, 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 the blood said. But when I left Byron behind in the jungle, I knew what I was. It was then that I first thought about my dying. There were times that I thought I could hide in anger at this country, the things that it had done, the things that it was doing, the people in charge on every reservation in urban Indian ghettos and Indian territories. I was so angry, it was wonderful. It fed the blood. I remember those days on the Oglala reservation. We were powerful in those dark hills. We were everywhere, like lights, like fireflies, which I've heard are disappearing now, like the bees. People died there. That fed the blood too. On the screen, I am terrifying. I am so terrifying that it is utterly beautiful, make no mistake. And I feel like someone should be proud. Look at me up there. My hair so black, my naked chest so brown, my eyes filled with stones. I look like a warrior. I dance, I sing, I fight. I am so beautiful in the dark. The dark is where I live. God, it's so cold. When I was a child, my mother would hold me in her long brown arms and rock me in the big wooden rocking chair and sing me to sleep with songs in Cherokee by the little black stove. Dad would come in from work on the ranch, and he would smell like big, wild animals and dust, like red, red dust. I was half asleep, and I could feel her chest rumble as she spoke. Everything was so warm, so beautiful. Can't I go back? I'm always trying. I want to say that I've done good things. I have done a lot of good things. I have helped bring our language back. There are things in our words that are not anywhere else in this wide green world. I know that. There is so much I refuse to leave behind, to lose. I have fought on those red hills. I have fought in the Badlands. I have lost things. But there is so much that I lost before I was even born. Sometimes the good things justify the bad. Sometimes everything is a song, a bird's wing song, quiet so you can hear it. I can't hear it anymore, but I used to when I was with her. But she's something I lost too. It hurts too much to think about it, like there's a black hole I was born with, pulling me in. She had soft blonde hair, so soft, like the wing of a bird. I was a child again in her arms. I hit her. I hit her so hard and I hated myself. I could never forgive myself. I left him in the fields. I drink, I push it down. There is no way back. When I was in the jungle, I pressed her picture to my heart, my feet rotting in those boots in that deep black mud, and I ran and I shot. I killed so many people. They were everywhere and they were everything. They filled up the sky. Byron was ahead of me. He was always leading. He was Ojibwe and he was my best friend. He looked behind to see if I'd fallen, because I did once, and that's when the explosions came. They came out of the ground as if something great and wide had opened up to eat us all. And I ran, and Byron died. There is no way back. On the screen, I feel like I redeem myself, forget myself. I am beautiful. And the women who follow me because of it, giving me beautiful, pure white things to snort and sweet, sparkling things to drink, understand. When I finally feel like I'm underwater and floating and laughing, they all look like her. They never look like Byron or my mother. I couldn't live through that. There is no way back. Everything is a story, a dream, don't you think? I do. I can see it all from here, the great red plains of Oklahoma, calling me like a song, like a bird's wing, like my mother calling me in Cherokee. Byron is alive. He lives in Minneapolis. My mother and father are proud of me, and they are still alive. She is still my lover. I live a life inside this cocoon of white and sparkling things. I drive around in a shiny, lovely thing, a thing that is like the panther that the women who love me are riding. I just have to keep pushing it all down until I crash. There is no way back. Thank you.
Thank you, Erika. That was lovely. Thank you. We're going to go into the Q&A section of our reading right now. So we're going to open it up to the audience, and see if they have questions. I also just wanted to make a note that from our visiting authors are available via Bear Pond Books. And Stefan, my husband, is also saying he really liked your reading. So thank you. Now we're just going to go into the Q&A. So if you're in the audience and if you have a question for any of our authors, please type it into the chat or turn on your microphone and say hello.
And just to help with the ease of things here, if you want to unmute yourself, just type into the chat if you have a question, and we will let you know. We'll kind of create a queue over here and call people to speak. And yeah, you can turn your video on as well when you are asking a question.
So one question I have, if I could go first, or I'll ask a question. So it was such a gorgeous reading. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Erika, and thank you, Kenzie. I have maybe slightly different questions for all of you. maybe I'll start with Kenzie first. I loved how you grounded your poems in locations and histories and in kind of the mapping of personal journeys. And I was wondering, you know, and what I loved about it is it incorporated both physical locations and, you know, game space and virtual realities, and that was amazing. And so I just wanted to know a little bit more about your poetic process. Do you think of these spaces first, and how you inhabit them, or how others in your family or in your community has inhabited these spaces, or do the poems and the images come first? I know we've kind of talked about verb forward languages versus image forward languages, so I just wanted to know a little bit more about your writing process.
That's a really cool question. So for a lot of the ones that aren't in the current manuscript, in my manuscript, that's the multimodal one, that's Wampum. Wampum's poems are really through a very different process than how I usually write. There was like a kind of template that I made where I sort of laid out all of the landscapes of my family's journey or major events that I wanted to kind of respond to for each of the sections. And then that actually was really challenging because I've had to write into a very particular space, and it's like 10 times harder. The normal process that I go through is usually involving my phone. It's usually like really late at night and I'm just like kept awake by something, or there's some kind of conflict in my life. Like the first one I read was, there was a conflict on actually an editorial team for a magazine that I was on, and I was kind of feeling like, well, this is weird. I'm like the only Native person, and like it was at a time before like we really talked a lot about environmental justice, and it was sort of like environmental perspectives are the privileged perspective, I think was what I was told. And I was sort of like, what does that even mean? And like, that makes no sense to me. And like, it would be great if I had someone else here to kind of back me up, but it was not that way. So a lot of the time when I have conflicts in my life, I just poem them out. And so that'll be usually a particular line we'll start it out, or some particular images. One of my favorite exercises to do is list making for low stakes writing. And one of the lists I do in every one of my notebooks is called "To Be Concerned Regarding," which is you just write "To Be Concerned Regarding" at the top, and you sort of make notes about the things that you care about in the world, or things that concern you, or certain images that you're haunted by, or obsessions. And that's something that you can always go back to and kind of combine with something else, like a particular subject. The snake game poem, for example, was sort of, I just really loved that game for a long time. And I was like, there's something in here about the way that like Native people are sometimes called apples, like red on the outside, white on the inside. There was something in there, and there was something in that movement of the snake that you could eat yourself. That kind of was when I was really frustrated with blood quantum, and I was writing a lot about blood quantum in my research stuff, and then that kind of came out in the poem. So I think it's just these conflicts in life and percolating on things and sort of reacting to things for a long time it was. And then nowadays, like it's more language based for sure. I don't know if it's so much verb based. I think that's something I need to work on. But as far as with Oneida things, like it is focused a lot on sort of these histories and these images, things like the painted coffee mugs in the cupboard. Like I'm staring at them right now. They're from the Ute reservation where my mom worked. And then you think about the Indian in the cupboard. So kind of playing with those stereotypical ideas, but with the newer book, it's really much more about the research-based stuff. And that's really hard because you end up being very narrative about it and like almost approaching prose if you're not careful with the language. So the journeys come before or after.
Other questions from the audience? Okay. Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead, Callie, with your question.
Callie, you might still be muted. So if you hover your mouse over the bottom of your screen and just tap it once, you should see the button to unmute. It looks like a microphone, and you'll want to click it so that it is no longer red.
Perfect.
There you are.
Can
Hi.
you hear me now? Hi. Sorry, I'm losing my voice right now. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you all for being here. And this is kind of a question for everyone, and it's less about writing and more about writing community. Nice to meet you. I feel like community is something that I'm constantly trying to develop, especially in the creative writing field. And I know how to advocate for my own community in writing, but I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on becoming an ally in the writing community. So, you know, for writers from different backgrounds and things, and how we can all work together to be better allies for our own or for other communities that we might not be a part of.
There we go. I can feel this if you don't mind me answering a serious question with a tiny poofy dog on my lap. She started to bark, and I thought that might be more disruptive. You know, I work really hard to do that. I mean, I fail all the time. I miss voices, and you know, I really am grateful when people, you know, point out like a new native voice. There was a woman, gosh, I'm trying to remember her first name, but her last name is so distinctive, it's unforgettable. It's Clapsaddle. And she's a member of the federally recognized Cherokee tribe in North Carolina. And I had written this article for BuzzFeed on different contemporary Native American writers, and someone was like, "What about?" And I felt really bad, and so I made sure to make up for that, you know. And I think there's, in the end, like, there's nothing wrong with loving the work that you love. And I still like David Foster Wallace. Like, I just like him. I do. Sometimes his fans are idiots. And he's definitely got a limitation to his thinking. And he kind of admitted that, but didn't know what to do about it. But it's okay to like, if you're a white lady, to like other white ladies' work. I think it's a matter of saying, okay, I have to do two things. I have to allow myself joy in reading, but I also have to like examine for just a moment, like, okay, what are my biases and why? You know, what pushes my buttons? And then, you know, really read widely, you know, in, you know, as much as you can, like the African tradition, the African American tradition, the Native American tradition, and see what books come across your way, and just don't just read the one book, right? The Sherman Alexie or the Tommy Orange. Be like, okay, who else is out there right now? Even if it's one or two other books, right? And then I think ultimately your aesthetic will shift and it will get bigger, and your community will get bigger with it. If you just try to do that, two or three authors in each group, like what gives you joy to read will get naturally bigger. And then ultimately, this sounds really dumb and trite, but like follow them on Twitter, because when they are like, oh, my book is being published, then you can retweet it, and it takes 2 seconds to support them. Like, so my job is a little, you know, more concrete, right? But I think if you just do that stuff, you're cool, you know, and you can still get joy out of whoever the heck you want to read, you know?
And I'll just jump in and say the elephant in the room, the pandemic has made it really tough for those of us who have books coming out right now. And we would love it if you can be an ally to whatever genre it is that you love. You know, we are struggling right now. All of us have had events canceled. So again, thank you, VCFA. We really appreciate it for giving us a voice here and a platform. But right now, my book comes out in August, and let's just say we're all on the verge of panic. Those of us who have books coming out, of course, pre-orders are appreciated, but just beyond that, like Erika was saying, you know, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, get the word out, and we genuinely appreciate it. These are trying times. And if you like one author, you'll often find that they will turn you on to other authors. You know, on my page all the time, I'm talking about a wonderful author right now called Kelly Jo Ford, who has a fantastic collection coming out. And so, you know, follow us. You know, it is more appreciated than you can know. So let me just end on that. Oh, I saw a question come in on chat. My book is called Winter Counts. Right now, my book is available on Amazon if you want to do that. Also, Bookshop is a really nice alternative platform. Always support your local bookstores if you can. They appreciate it. They need your business right now, but we appreciate it like you can't imagine. So again, thank you very much.
Thanks, David. And I just want to let folks know in the chat space, you will find the link to Bear Pond Books, which is Montpelier's local bookshop. And you can order all of our readers' books there, and they are still shipping books out right now.
I was just going to jump in on the question a little bit about community, just as far as online communities. There's sort of like expanding into Facebook groups is kind of the way that I've found community, especially because I'm pretty isolated over here in Norway while I've been living here. On Twitter, there is also just like hashtag native Twitter, hashtag Black Twitter. There's a Twitter movement that's associated with, in response to the book American Dirt. Miriam Gerba is a really good person to follow for that. So there are these sort of like communities on Twitter that are beyond just the writing community. They include the writing community usually, and they also have a lot of people who are talking about sort of critical issues, but from not necessarily from an academic perspective. And I think that's a really important thing to kind of expand your network into, is just people, like people who are out there doing the thing, living the thing, people who are affected. Another, like, for example, that's how I learned more about the Friedman, is by talking to, like, by following a particular Friedman scholar and writer. Although, like, I use those terms loosely, like, I consider him a scholar, because he shares a lot of these resources. And those resources are around online, but I think, like, really connecting with people, however you have to do it, you sort of develop more of a sense of what they're going through. And that helps you to be a better ally in terms of, like, empathy rather than sympathy. And sort of understanding, maybe changing language around and how you talk to people or how you phrase things. Accessibility as well. So I think it's like expanding your networks, following writers and things like that. But there's also some writing groups online. There are large Facebook groups for various writers and subgroups of writers. And it'd be great to, one of the things I'd like to do with Apiary someday is start these like online communities for particular writers, so that, like, for example, Native writers can talk to each other when they need their own space, but then there can be a larger space maybe for, like, people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color. So it's sort of, there's a lot of potential there in the online medium, but it's also sometimes, like, also not an accessible space. So you do what you can, really.
Thank you, Kenzie. I just saw a question come through on the chat, and I'll read it out. It's from Dexter, and it says, when trying to make characters who are members of different communities which you are not a part of, how do you write them without furthering stereotypes and in a way that creates depth with issues that they may be facing?
I'd like to field that really quickly, actually, because I talk a lot about it. I honestly can say that literally at every single Associated Writers Program panel I've had, even if it's on Native poetics, half of the audience after our presentation will raise their hands and say, can I write about Indians? I've got emails to this effect. And it just kind of, it always strikes me that, like, why, and, I think if you really want to start with that, though, one of the things to think about is, why do I want to do this? Am I a white guy who grew up in a Black neighborhood? Well, then okay, that kind of makes sense, because it would be weird to excise a part of your childhood and a part of your life, and to excise race from your work. But if you're like one day, like, what's cool? Fucking Indians, those are cool. And you know nothing about them, right? But you just think it's cool to write about them, but you've not read one book by Native people. And there are a series of questions I think me and other people are beginning to ask folks, right? Why? Ask yourself why. Did you grow up near, or are you living near, or are you, a population, not just one person, but a group of people, and it would just be weird to excise them from your world? If so, okay, then have you read a lot of books by that population, a lot of fiction or in your genre, poetry or nonfiction in that genre? And then if so, I think maybe basing them off of the people that you actually know, and not just one person, but like the variety of people that you know. And if you don't know a variety of those folks, maybe instead of writing them for them, just support them and read the work by them. Maybe that's another alternative, So I keep doing this wrong.
Thank you. There's another chat that just came through from Darla. She says, I grew up with a mom always telling us, you're an Indian and don't you forget it, yet never telling us what that meant. I'm an enrolled member of the Delaware tribe, but I was raised as a white girl and I look like a white girl. I have imposter syndrome. Help. Do people who have a higher blood quantum judge people like me?
I can probably address this a little bit if y'all can hear me. There are 577 native nations in the USA, and every nation, you can hear me? Okay, cool. Every nation is different and every community is different. And are there people that will judge you at times? Yes, it is. Indeed, my novel Winter Counts is really about identity. And my protagonist is an Iyeska, which in our language means translator or speaks white, but has sort of become a slur, which means half-breed and not in a nice way. And so in my book, he really struggles with that. But I hesitate to generalize about every Native community, because in some Native communities, they're very accepting. In others, there are still these lingering prejudices. And so, there's not one answer, but sure, I mean, it is a difficult journey that all of us have to kind of take. So I'll end there.
I just want to thank Erika too, because I think I had a conversation with her very early on about this kind of issue. I think we were at AWP and we were hanging out, and Erika was showing me her amazing bracelet collection. And it took a long time for me to really even say I was an Oneida poet. In my household, people, that was what we were, and that was every single day that was reaffirmed, and my family would be really upset with me if I denied that. But it was kind of something that I didn't feel comfortable right at first in terms of poetry, and this kind of goes back to what Erika said about read who you love. Well, I love people like Stephen Dunn and Dorian Lux, and these kind of wisdom poets are some of my favorite, but they tend to be pretty white. And I don't know, I just, you'll never tear me away from Stephen Dunn. I love that man. But so I came into the poetry world kind of from that perspective, and I had things I wanted to say about my background, but I didn't feel comfortable yet. And so actually when I first started out, I also was worried about my own tribal community, because we were starting to integrate back into our reservation community. It's a very urban reservation. It's patchwork here at a city. So it's kind of a different, it might be a little bit different in those terms. And we have actually a pretty high blood quantum as well. So my mother is an enrolled tribes member, and I always say I'm a descendant because I want to respect the sovereignty of my tribe to determine their membership. But I also get my healthcare through the tribe. I sort of am tied to the reservation to get my healthcare because I'm a descendant. And every week, my mom's calling me about, general tribal council meetings and gabbing about that. And so it's really the community of it has become a much larger part of my life later. But I was still struggling. And so sometimes I would even substitute Menominee instead of Oneida when I would be writing about it. I wouldn't put it out in the world. But when I was kind of writing for myself, I was even too scared to claim the thing that really my community had claimed me. And we talk about that. It's not just who you claim, but who claims you. And there can be a lot of dislocations as part of that, the adoption pipeline, et cetera. But I think something that Hyde Erdrich had said to me really stuck with me, which was that she said, well, if you weren't Oneida, would you really be worrying so much about this? And I said, no, you're right. And then she said, if you said you weren't Oneida, wouldn't that upset your mother and your grandmother? And yes, it absolutely would. My grandmother would be very hurt for me not to be who I am and to be willing to speak that aloud. But it did take a long time to kind of adapt my writing practices to it and kind of like what I felt comfortable to say and what I didn't. And even now, I still feel a responsibility to my reservation community and my tribal community in order to, I know she made me cry too, like when she said that to me. And then I never looked back. But I do have a responsibility to my tribe. My mom is working for our tribe in the tribal government. So there are certain things that I don't say. And there are certain things that stories that shouldn't be shared and that can't be shared or that can't be accessed. And so especially when I'm writing nonfiction, I'm like particularly careful about how I write it. And my own perception of things has evolved so much over the last like decade, over the last 5 years even, that some of the things that I started writing 5 years ago, I look at them and I'm like, oh my gosh, no, I have such a different perspective on it now. And I'm so glad I didn't put that out in the world at the time. And some things that I look back on that I did put out because I felt pressured to publish that stuff, like I'm horrified and I'm like, no, I feel like I didn't say it right and I'm giving the wrong impression about it. So there is a certain amount of caution there and I get it. And even when I'm on like in Milwaukee and hanging out in the AIS office with like other Oneida folks, like they're literally talking in front of me, like not knowing my particular status. Like they're talking about how like the descendants shouldn't be getting healthcare because it's taking away healthcare from the elders. And I'm like, well, don't you think the descendants are children of the elders? And like, don't you think the elders kind of like asked for their children to be covered? At least like my family did, and I know several others who did. So it's interesting. You will run into that, but just kind of like I think working on your own relationship with it and your own connections, and going ahead and like exploring the particular traditions and like really striving to understand them and striving to like kind of keep them as a part of your life is, you know, it can be really transforming and it can be really, really like it can soothe the spirit. So yeah.
Thank you, Kenzie. There's one more question in the chat actually for you from Diana Norma, and it says, how has living abroad informed or changed your perspectives on identity and belonging?
It's a really good question. So some of the poems in the new book that I'm writing actually are poems that interact with this idea of like living in Norway and being Native and kind of being like, I'm not the only one, but when I go out, people are like really shocked to see me or like really shocked to hear about it. And another thing that I've been doing while I've been here is I have a lot of friends who are Sami. And so I've been kind of like meeting with them and trying to hear their stories. And I've been seeing a lot of similarities with, for instance, their experiences in boarding schools. They had their own assimilation period. So I'm kind of like interested in those transnational connections, but also like I think there was one time where like the newspaper was writing an article about how the finance minister in Norway had attended a like Thanksgiving party and dressed up in full buckskin like costume thing. And this was like the entire finance minister of Norway. I don't even want to say the name because like there's just like I've gotten so much blowback about it. But they were reaching out to me because they wanted a Native American perspective on it. But then the rest of the voices in the article were Sami, and I was really quite delighted that they focused on Sami voices and featured Sami voices. And they cut down my quote quite a bit. But like I was like I'm just hiding a little bit here because like I have thoughts, but I was trying to kind of temper them a little bit because I'm an immigrant here as well. But yeah, I ended up at a pride party one time and a guy came up to me and he just sort of like started mowing me down about what I had said in this newspaper. And I was like, did you read the Sami voices in there? But he was like, don't impose your perspective on us. Like, it's not actually a big deal here, etc. But then when I go in the grocery store, there's like these beer cans that have dead Indians on them, like on the like art for the beer can. And for like months and months, I would just turn the cans around as this kind of like quiet form of resistance. So there is that kind of internalized colonialism over here. There's that internalized Wild West stuff. Like, it's particularly true of Germany, for example. Like, I hear a lot about that. And I think like in Norway, people are much more willing to have the conversation, but they really think that racism is an American problem, even though, and Norway isn't as white as it wants to imagine that it is. It really isn't. It's just, there is a form of erasure that happens here. So I'm trying to find things that I've tried to find things I love about Norway. I've tried to find things to honor about Norway. Kon-Tiki is one of my favorite stories of Norway, but at the same time, it is a sort of like just a strange feeling sometimes. But that also kind of calls upon you to go ahead and be strong in who you are and do a lot. Like, I end up doing a lot of educating in conversations with it. But I also kind of want to respect people's space. Like, I'm trying to learn their traditions, like the fact that they don't like to stand next to each other at the bus stop, so they're already socially isolating all the time. If you're in an elevator, like, you have to occupy the furthest spaces in the elevator, and you don't say hi to people unless you're skiing up higher in a certain altitude, mostly because like you'd be interrupting their day. So it's just a completely different perspective than like Texas, where we would like be rude if you didn't say hi to someone you were passing by.
Thank you, Kenzie. I saw that Rita has a question about voice, and then after that, we can probably make time for one more question after Rita's if anybody wants to jump in the queue here. So Rita, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay, great. So I just have a quick question. And this is for all of you, particularly maybe for Dave and for Erika, which is, as you're writing in different genres, how are you developing unique voices in each? Because I think in Dave's, nonfiction versus fiction, the voices were so very different. You know, the nonfiction was very vulnerable, open, very much focused on present action. And the nonfiction, the fiction itself was so beautiful in terms of its description and world building and sense of time passing. Action happening in real time in scene, but also memory and images kind of haunting that piece. So I wanted to ask about voice, and Erika, you do a beautiful thing as well with voice and Buckskin Cocaine, where each of your characters has such a unique personality, even though they're speaking in first person. And how might voice also relate to questions of identity, especially if you're talking about how people from different communities may relate to one another. So I come from a South Asian background. I'm Bengali, and the way Bengalis talk about their neighbors, such as Hindi speakers or Gujaratis or Punjabis, is very different. And to translate that is a difficult thing. And sometimes you don't want to translate. I think sometimes you just want to have those voices be polyphonic and chaotic on the page, or so on. So I just wanted to know a little bit on the craft side, and also in terms of character development or speaker development, how you're approaching the question of voice.
Well, I can start, and I'll keep it short because I think Erika is really the master of voice. So for my nonfiction, my creative nonfiction piece, that's just my voice. Creative nonfiction is hard for me to write because that's just me coming out straight and unadulterated. And so I don't know that I really develop my voice. That's just me just coming out there and pouring out, the pain and what I'm feeling. The whole piece, I talk about visiting the graves of my auntie and cousin who were murdered. And so I don't really, for me, it's not so much about developing a voice in creative nonfiction. It's finding a way to modulate my natural voice and get it to express, what I'm trying to get across. Now, fiction, that's a different story. And what I do, and I'm going to defer to Erika, who I think is much better at this than I am, but when I have a fictional character, I do a lot of thinking about his or her background, where they come from. I use almost a form of method acting, to kind of see how do they see the world? How do they speak? What are their dialogue quirks? All of these things. I do a lot of work to kind of make sure that all of my characters have a different worldview and distinctive voice. So again, it's really a form of method acting. So I'll toss it to Erika, who I'm sure has a lot better tips than me.
No, I think, yeah, I think I have much the same to say. I started with poetry and then moved to fiction, although I was kind of writing fiction at the same time, and I always knew that my foot would be more firmly in fiction. The only reason I started writing nonfiction is because my press, Curbside, who took Crazy Horse's Girlfriend, really wanted me to publish in like different magazines because this sort of intellectual clickbait like draws people to your fiction, right? And so I started doing it, and I had a particular interest and talent, I guess, in it. But it made me realize that in the end, I really like forms, and that's why I think maybe that's part of where the scholar comes in, and that's how I work. Like I've never written such long poems that they just become stories. I can't do that. I'm not a particularly good narrative poet, but I really write pretty straight narrative fiction, except when I'm not, right? Except when I'm writing something that's an internal monologue. And then nonfiction, I tend to go a little more journalistic and scholarly with the sort of personality. My dog's just wanting in and out of the room. Sorry. But I think, like Dave, I think I'm very led by personality, and more specifically, I think I'm led by voice. And I think that's because I've always been extremely compelled and sometimes horrified by people's inner landscapes. And I spend a lot of time thinking about that. And even though I wasn't like reading Faulkner and Joyce like extremely joyfully or like, oh my God, this is my jam, I was still fascinated by the idea that you could be somehow putting a like a camera on someone's inner life, and like what could it look like, and what techniques would you utilize in order, voice being the primary one, right? Like Dave was saying, to make it as if someone could speak completely honestly what they would say. Of course, crafted into a piece, right? With a climax theoretically, even if it's a subtle one. And so, yeah, as far as translating for a larger audience, I guess I more or less really got angry about the idea that I would have to choose. And I decided to be like Vonnegut and say, I only have to write for one person. And for him, that was his sister. And I'm going to do the same. I'm going to write for maybe not me exactly. I'm not going to write for an outside audience. I'm going to write for someone who's similar enough to me, but is not me. I'm going to do it that way in my head. And so therefore I don't have to choose. And maybe I'm pretending, but it works for me.
I think, well, I started out in fiction actually, like a long time ago when I was first starting to do workshops and first starting to study in school. And I think what it turned out to be was that a lot of the voices were very like dreamlike, and they were just overly lyrical. So I think it's sort of like, okay, I guess I'm a poet after a little while. I am working on a young adult novel, but that's a completely different, it's like terrible, like enjoyably terrible fantasy style young adult novel. Like I'm just trying to hit the pocket of the genre fiction, like right there. So that's a completely different voice for me. And I do think a lot more about characterization and kind of like how these people would speak. But when I'm writing like poetry and nonfiction, I think I'm led more by emotion. I'm led more by sort of getting at those feelings without necessarily not telling those feelings, but kind of using language and lyricism to evoke those same feelings in a reader or to invite them into a shared empathy experience. And I think also what Erika brought up about like forms, I think a lot about context aware forms. So and this is something my advisor suggested to me more recently. So like for example, a villanelle with its repetitions might get at something about the sort of like cyclical looping nature of ancestral time, or it might get at the sort of like phrases that we end up hearing day in and day out, like the Indian in the cupboard over and over again, these sort of stereotypical phrases, or these walls that you keep coming up against over and over again. And the form is sort of informed by what you're trying to get at. So I think a lot about the context of our forms, and then also just, it's always led by emotion. When I'm doing creative nonfiction, it's essentially kind of the same voice, or it's my voice outside of the kind of like structure of the speaker. I don't even think I think about the speaker when I'm writing creative nonfiction. But I also find that like there are just certain stories I can't tell in poetry because I would have to explain, like, for instance, what assimilation is, or what, I mean, sometimes I've like had an excerpt from the NAGPRA Act, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation, but it's a lot to try to fit into a poem and fit into the form of a poem. And I think that the poem really wants to be doing something else. And eventually the poem will tell you it wants to do something else, and you kind of got to follow where it's going. But with creative nonfiction, it's really focused on storytelling and kind of sharing these experiences. So with that, there ends up being a lot of lyricism because language is the sort of like pivot for me.
Thank you, Kenzie and Erika and David. I do not see, oh, my camera's not on, so sorry, didn't mean to be a disembodied voice there. I don't see any other questions in the chat, and we are a few minutes over our promised time, so I don't know if Rita, you had any closing thoughts?
Sure, yeah. I just wanted to thank all of our speakers. I see the thank yous are pouring in. If everyone would like to unmute themselves, let's give Dave, Kenzie, and Erika a round of applause. So thank you. Thank you for watching.
Thank you, Erika and David. This was amazing. And I love seeing you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Kenzie and Erika, it's been lovely having you here. It's been a delight. Thank you so much for joining us remotely during this pandemic season of ours. And we would be honored and delighted to invite you to VCFA in the near future. Hopefully starting in September, all of our classes will resume on campus as expected. Please come and stop by and say hello. It was lovely, and I really look forward to continuing this conversation. I've learned so much from all three of you today in terms of craft, in terms of stories, in terms of, you know, stories and histories of the lands that we inhabit. And I thank you so much. I'll hand over the mic to Kenzie, Erika, and Dave. If you guys want to say anything as closing thoughts, you're welcome to do so. And I look forward to having you guys back soon and being in more convo. Thank you.
I just want to say
is thank you so much. Yeah. Same. I was going to say the same thing you were going to say, Dave. Thank you so much. And Kenzie, it's an honor to read with you too.
And I'll just say thanks, and what an honor it is to even be back at virtually at VCFA, you know, so thank you again so much, everyone.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you, guys. This is wonderful, and it definitely gives a little bit of light to the day, which for the most part is very dark because it's winter here in Norway. So thank you for being the light in the day when the sun goes down at like 3 p.m.
Thank you, Kenzie. Thank you so much. Thanks. I will share your email addresses with our students. Some people may be in touch with you. If there's other community members who are not part of VCFA who joined this call, who would like to be in contact with any of our visiting writers, please send me an email. My email I will write. It's rita.banerjee@vcfa.edu. And if there's any follow-up questions and so on, be in touch. Thank you so much to our visiting writers one more time, and thank you to all of our guests who joined us, you know, both members of our community and those who came from outside of it. This was a lovely first virtual reading, and our next one is going to be on April 17th. It's going to be a literary salon run by Devotri Dar from the University of Michigan, featuring Sean Prentice, who is a nonfiction faculty of ours, and Anne Cardinal, who just wrote a book called 5 Midnights. It's a YA thriller set in Puerto Rico. post-hurricane and so on. So, please check out those authors. We will invite, you, Dave, Erika, and Kenzie as well to that. So thank you, and have a lovely evening. Have a good night.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.